I hope that religious leaders here in Burkina Faso also take advantage of this moment to preach.
At 36 years old, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stands as the world's youngest president, leading not just a country, but a continental awakening. In May 2024, he stood before thousands of farmers in Burkina Faso, announcing the distribution of agricultural equipment and inputs worth over 78 billion CFA francs. That's approximately 130 million US dollars. This wasn't just another development program. This was a declaration of war on dependency. But here's what makes this story different from every other African development tale you've heard. Traoré isn't asking for permission. He's not waiting for foreign donors, and he's certainly not apologizing for putting his people first. Today, we're diving into the real story of how Burkina Faso is transforming itself from aid recipient to agricultural powerhouse, and why the rest of Africa is watching with fascination. So settle in, because what you're about to hear is not a fairy tale. It's the documented factual account of what happens when African leadership decides that enough is enough. Ibrahim Traoré didn't politely request power, he took it. Twice. In January 2022, he was part of the coup that removed President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore. 8 months later, in September 2022, he led another coup against his own ally, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, because the pace of change wasn't fast enough for a country bleeding from jihadist insurgency and economic stagnation. At 34, when he first seized power, Traoré became Africa's youngest head of state. But this isn't some ambitious young officer drunk on power. This is a man driven by a very specific vision that Thomas Sankara would recognize immediately. Since September 2022, Burkina Faso has been led by a transition government headed by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and in those short years, the transformation has been nothing short of remarkable. Burkina Faso's GDP grew from approximately $18.8 billion to $22.1 billion under his leadership, a growth rate that most African countries can only dream of. But GDP numbers don't tell the full story. What matters is where that growth is coming from and who's benefiting from it. And that's where Traoré's agricultural revolution becomes the story of our time. Agriculture represents 30 to 40% of Burkina Faso's GDP, with 86% of the population involved in it. Yet for decades, this agricultural nation had been trapped in a paradox, growing food but still dependent on imports, having farmers but lacking food security, possessing fertile soil but importing basic necessities. Then came May 6, 2024. President Ibrahim Traoré distributed agricultural equipment and inputs worth over 78 billion CFA francs to farmers, aiming to boost agricultural productivity and promote food self-sufficiency. But the numbers alone don't capture the revolutionary nature of what was happening. This year, we are making available twice the amount of equipment compared to 2023 and over 5 times the average quantity distributed in the past 5 years. Similarly, the provision of chemical fertilizers will see an allocation of approximately 68,900 tons, more than double the amount distributed in 2023, and over 5 times the average of the past 5 years, stated President Traoré. Think about what that means. In 1 year, Traoré quintupled the agricultural investment compared to the 5-year average. This isn't incremental change, this is transformation at revolutionary speed. But here's what separates Traoré from typical African leaders who make grand agricultural promises. He understands that real food sovereignty isn't just about having more tractors or fertilizer. It's about fundamentally changing the relationship between the state and the farmer, between Africa and the global food system. Ibrahim Traoré has launched ambitious agricultural initiatives in Burkina Faso, reminding many of Thomas Sankara's revolutionary vision. This isn't accidental. Traoré is consciously channeling Sankara's belief that a country cannot be truly independent if it cannot feed its people. The distribution of equipment came with something unprecedented. President Traoré encouraged young people to engage in agriculture, highlighting the presence of regional focal points who will assist aspiring producers. This is crucial. For too long, African agriculture has been seen as the occupation of the old, the poor, the uneducated. Traoré is flipping that narrative completely. When you make farming cool, when you make it profitable, when you make it a path to prosperity rather than poverty, that's when you start a real revolution. What's happening in Burkina Faso isn't occurring in isolation. Ibrahim Traoré has been recognized as Africa's most charismatic leader of 2024 by Africa Headline, following a comprehensive analysis of his leadership style, political achievements, and ability to inspire millions. But it's not just charisma driving this recognition, it's results. At just 36 years old, Ibrahim Traoré stands as the world's youngest president, leading Burkina Faso through a period of remarkable transformation. Across Africa, young people are watching Burkina Faso with intense interest. They're seeing a leader who doesn't apologize for African priorities, who doesn't beg for international approval, who doesn't accept that dependency is inevitable. In university campuses from Accra to Nairobi, students are asking the same question. If Burkina Faso can do it, why can't we? That question keeps former colonial powers awake at night. Let's talk numbers, because that's where Traoré's revolution becomes impossible to dismiss. The 78 billion CFA francs investment in agriculture isn't borrowed money. It's not aid. It's not a World Bank project with conditions attached. It's Burkina Faso's own resources being invested in Burkina Faso's own people. He has rejected loans from international lenders that come with strings attached. This is revolutionary thinking in a continent where most leaders would never dare refuse international financing, regardless of the conditions. But here's the genius of Traoré's approach. By investing in food production, he's not just improving agriculture, he's reducing imports, saving foreign exchange, creating jobs, and building the foundation for true economic independence. Burkina Faso's climate is tropical, with a very long dry season going from November to May. This is the major constraint of Burkina Faso's agricultural production, which is essentially rain-fed. Traditional wisdom would say, see, that's why you need to import food. Traoré's wisdom says, that's exactly why we need to master our own agricultural systems. One of the most strategically brilliant aspects of Traoré's agricultural initiative is his focus on youth engagement. President Traoré encouraged young people to engage in agriculture, highlighting the presence of regional focal points who will assist aspiring producers. This addresses one of Africa's most pressing challenges: youth unemployment. Across the continent, millions of young people migrate to cities looking for jobs that don't exist, or attempt dangerous journeys to Europe seeking opportunities they could create at home. Traoré is saying, the opportunities are here. The land is here. The market is here. We just need to organize ourselves properly. When you combine agricultural investment with youth empowerment, you're not just growing crops. You're growing a generation of Africans who believe in African solutions to African problems. Ibrahim Traoré has launched ambitious agricultural initiatives in Burkina Faso, reminding many of Thomas Sankara's revolutionary vision. This comparison isn't casual. It's central to understanding what's happening in Burkina Faso today. Thomas Sankara, who led Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987, had a simple philosophy. A soldier without political or ideological training is a potential criminal. But he also believed that a nation without food sovereignty is a nation waiting to be conquered. Sankara was assassinated in 1987, likely with French complicity, because his vision of African self-reliance was too dangerous to the established order. But his ideas never died. They lived in the hearts of young Burkinabés like Ibrahim Traoré, who grew up hearing stories about the president who dared to tell Africa that it didn't need permission to prosper. Now, nearly 4 decades later, Traoré is implementing Sankara's vision with 21st century tools and strategies. Here's something most analyses miss. Traoré's agricultural revolution isn't separate from his security strategy. It is his security strategy. Almost half of the Burkinabe population is moderately or severely affected by food insecurity. Think about what that means for national stability. When people can't feed their families, when young men can't find work, when rural communities are abandoned, that's when insurgencies find fertile ground for recruitment. Traoré understands that you cannot secure a country militarily if you haven't secured it economically. Every young man working on a profitable farm is a young man who won't be tempted by extremist recruiters. Every rural community with thriving agriculture is a community that will resist outside agitators. This is why his agricultural investment isn't just economic policy. It's the most sophisticated counterinsurgency strategy imaginable. What's happening in Burkina Faso is being watched across Africa with intense interest. From Senegal to Somalia, from Ghana to Zimbabwe, young Africans are asking, what if we stopped asking for help and started helping ourselves? The agricultural revolution Traoré is leading challenges the fundamental assumptions of African development. For 60 years, we've been told that African agriculture is inefficient, that we need international expertise, that we should focus on exports and import our food needs. Traoré is proving that this entire framework was designed to keep Africa dependent, not to help Africa develop. When other African leaders see Burkina Faso's GDP growing while rejecting international loans, when they see agricultural productivity increasing through domestic investment, when they see youth embracing farming because it's profitable, they start asking different questions about their own countries. One crucial aspect of Traoré's agricultural revolution is his approach to technology. Rather than waiting for foreign companies to bring solutions, Burkina Faso is developing and adapting technologies that serve African conditions and African priorities. Predominant crops are cereals, sorghum, millet, maize, rice, fonio, cash crops, cotton, groundnut, cowpea, sugarcane. Roots and tubers crops, cassava, sweet potato, yam, fruits and vegetables. These are crops that have fed Africa for centuries, that are adapted to African climates, that don't require expensive imported inputs. The revolution isn't about abandoning traditional crops for cash crops that benefit foreign markets. It's about using modern techniques, equipment, and organization to maximize the productivity of crops that actually feed African people. While the headlines focus on Traoré's military background and political achievements, one of the most significant aspects of his agricultural revolution is how it's empowering women. In most African societies, women do the majority of food production work, yet they rarely control the resources or benefit from the profits. The distribution of equipment and inputs to farmers necessarily includes women farmers, who are often the backbone of food production. When you provide agricultural equipment to farming communities, you're not just increasing productivity, you're changing gender dynamics in ways that ripple through entire societies. Burkina Faso's climate is tropical, with a very long dry season going from November to May. This is the major constraint of Burkina Faso's agricultural production, which is essentially rain-fed. Climate change is making these challenges worse. Traditional rainfall patterns are becoming less reliable. Droughts are more frequent and severe. Floods are more destructive when they come. But rather than using climate change as an excuse for continued dependency, Traoré is using it as motivation for agricultural innovation. When you know you can't rely on others for food security, you become very creative about water management, soil conservation, and crop selection. Let's do some basic mathematics. The provision of chemical fertilizers will see an allocation of approximately 68,900 tons in 2024. Previously, much of this would have been imported using scarce foreign exchange. But when you produce fertilizer locally or substitute it with locally produced organic alternatives, you're not just saving money. You're building industrial capacity, creating jobs, and reducing vulnerability to global supply chain disruptions. Every ton of food produced locally is foreign exchange saved, jobs created, and dependency reduced. Multiply that across an entire agricultural system, and you're talking about fundamental economic transformation. One often overlooked aspect of Traoré's transformation is his approach to education. While much attention focuses on his agricultural and security policies, he has also implemented free education from nursery through university. This is strategically brilliant. Education without economic opportunity leads to frustration and emigration. But when you combine free education with agricultural modernization, you create a generation of educated young people who have opportunities at home. Imagine university graduates who don't have to choose between staying home and being unemployed, or leaving for Europe and abandoning their communities. Imagine young people with technical knowledge who can apply that knowledge to transforming their own agricultural systems. At just 35 years old, Traoré exemplifies a new wave of African leadership, marked by authenticity, pragmatism, and a deep connection with the people. But his influence extends far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, there's a growing movement of leaders and activists who are tired of the old development paradigm. They're tired of being told what's best for their countries by people who have never lived in their countries. They're tired of policies designed in Washington and London for implementation in Accra and Nairobi. Traoré represents the possibility that Africa can chart its own course, make its own mistakes, and celebrate its own successes. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership has sparked hope with bold reforms, but time will show if it marks genuine transformation or repeats the mistakes of military rule. Critics point to the lack of democratic elections, concerns about human rights, and questions about long-term sustainability. These are legitimate concerns that shouldn't be dismissed. Military leaders have promised transformation before, only to become part of the problem they claim to solve. But here's what's different about Traoré. The results are measurable, the investments are documented, and the transformation is visible to ordinary Burkinabé in their daily lives. When farmers receive equipment worth billions of CFA francs, when agricultural productivity increases, when food security improves, That's not propaganda, that's reality. The challenge will be translating the country's rich mineral resources and promising economy into stability and development. This challenge isn't unique to Burkina Faso, it's the central challenge facing every African nation. But Traoré's approach offers a template that other African leaders are studying carefully. Invest in agriculture, empower youth, reduce dependency, build from your own resources. Don't ask for permission. Whether this template can be replicated across the continent remains to be seen. Different countries have different conditions, different resources, different challenges, but the psychological impact of seeing one African country succeed through self-reliance rather than dependency, that impact is already rippling across the continent. In spring 2023, Traoré questioned the planned restoration of democracy for 2024, stating that elections could not be held unless the insurgents were pushed back and the security situation had been improved. This raises important questions about the relationship between development and democracy, between security and politics, between immediate needs and long-term governance. Traoré's argument is that you cannot have meaningful democracy in a country where people are hungry, insecure, and economically desperate. First, you address the basic needs. Then, you build institutions that can sustain democracy. His critics argue that this is the classic excuse of authoritarian leaders who promise to deliver development first and democracy later, a promise that's rarely kept. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What matters is whether the agricultural transformation continues, whether the benefits reach ordinary people, and whether institutions are being built that can outlast any individual leader. What we're witnessing in Burkina Faso is part of a broader continental awakening. From Paul Kagame's Rwanda to Abiy Ahmed's Ethiopia, from Julius Malema's South Africa to Hakainde Hichilema's Zambia, a new generation of African leaders is asking fundamental questions about development, governance, and continental unity. They're not all following the same model. They don't all have the same ideology. But they share a common rejection of the idea that Africa must always be the junior partner in global affairs. Traoré's agricultural revolution represents one approach to this challenge. Others will develop different approaches. What matters is that the conversation has changed from how do we attract foreign investment to how do we develop our own resources. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's achievements in the agricultural sector are simply fascinating and should provide food for thought for leaders across Africa and beyond. The question isn't whether Traoré's approach is perfect. The question is whether it's pointing toward a more sustainable model of African development. The significant investment in agricultural equipment and resources reflects a renewed focus on bolstering Burkina Faso's agricultural sector and achieving food self-sufficiency. Whether this investment translates into long-term food security, economic growth, and political stability remains to be seen. But what's already clear is that millions of young Africans are watching this experiment with hope and excitement. They're seeing proof that African leaders can prioritize African interests, that African resources can benefit African people, that African solutions can work for African problems. The real story of Ibrahim Traoré's agricultural revolution isn't about rice imports or solar tractors or QR codes. It's about something much more fundamental: the belief that Africa doesn't need to ask permission to prosper. This initiative, part of the government's efforts to support local producers, includes a significant increase in resources compared to previous years, with a focus on encouraging youth participation in agriculture and enhancing the agro-pastoral and fisheries sectors. When a 36-year-old African president can quintuple agricultural investment in a single year using domestic resources, when he can grow GDP by 20% while rejecting international loans, when he can inspire youth to see farming as a path to prosperity rather than poverty, that's not just policy success, that's psychological transformation. The seeds Traoré is planting in Burkina Faso's soil are growing into ideas that are spreading across the continent. The idea that dependency is not inevitable. The idea that African problems require African solutions. The idea that we don't need to wait for anyone else to give us permission to feed our own people. Whether this agricultural revolution succeeds or fails, whether Traoré's governance model proves sustainable or not, the idea has already taken root. And ideas, once planted in fertile ground, have a way of growing beyond their original borders. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that Africa has always had the resources to prosper, we just needed leaders brave enough to use them, then don't let this conversation end here. Share this video with every young African who has ever been told that success means leaving home. Send it to your uncle who still remembers when farming was respected work. Forward it to your prayer group, your study group, your WhatsApp family chat. But most importantly, ask yourself, what would happen if more African leaders followed Traoré's example? What would happen if more African countries decided to invest in their own people rather than beg for foreign investment? What would happen if Africa stopped asking for help and started helping itself? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what food sovereignty means in your country. Tell us about the traditional crops your grandparents grew that could feed your nation if given proper support. If you believe that 78 billion CFA francs invested in African farmers is more revolutionary than any speech about democracy, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel if you want to follow the real stories of African transformation, because Burkina Faso is just the beginning. The future of Africa is being written in the fields of Burkina Faso, by young farmers with new equipment and old wisdom, led by a president who understands that true independence starts with the ability to feed your own people. Thank you for watching, thank you for believing, and remember, we don't grow food just to survive. We grow food so we never have to bow again. Until next time, keep your eyes on the soil and your heart on the future. Africa is rising, one harvest at a time.